Welcome to the Blue Mouse Knits. Today I'm going to show you how to work a swatch in the round. There can often be a big gauge or tension difference when knitting something flat versus knitting something in the round. So it's very important if you're knitting a pattern in the round that needs to be a specific size, like a sweater, for example, that you work a swatch in the round. If you're a beginner, I have a couple videos on what gauge and swatching are and some tips for it. I always suggest that you make a large swatch, larger than you probably want to knit. I always aim to have about 8 to 10 inches square, which I know is a lot, but today I'm going to show you on a much smaller swatch just for the sake of time. I always suggest that you cast on more stitches than you think you're going to need because your end few stitches on both ends are going to be a little bit sloppy. And an important note about working a swatch in the round is that you will need a set of circular needles. This cannot be done on straight needles. Swatching in the round can be done in any stitch, but I'm going to demonstrate it in stockinette. For my first row, I'm just going to work it across. So for stockinette, I'm just going to knit across. Once you get to the end of your first row, you're not going to turn your work because you never do when you're working in the round. So instead, I'm just going to pull on my needle and slide down to the other needle. So now my yarn is attached to the wrong side. I like to create some kind of tension. I'm going to take my middle finger on my right hand. I'm going to wrap the yarn around it once or twice. There's two ways you can do this. If you want to unravel your swatch and keep the yarn for later, you want to have plenty of yarn wrapped around your finger because this is going to lay flat behind your swatch and it has to be as wide as your swatch. So I could kind of measure out how wide I want my swatch to be and then wrap that around my finger for tension. But if you intend to cut it, which is also an option, you only need to wrap it a couple times if you're not worried about conserving the yarn. Now I'm just going to knit across again. After a few stitches, I can release the tension yarn from my right hand and keep working all the way across. Again, if you're knitting something like moss stitch, this would just be row 2 of moss stitch in the round. So now that we've reached the end of row 2, I can go ahead and slide down to the other needle. And then again, we need to tension our yarn. If you're conserving yarn, you need to wrap around your finger a lot. So you have a really long float behind your swatch, but if you're not conserving yarn, you can wrap around 2 or 3 times. And it's that simple. You're just going to slide down at the end of each row, tension the yarn around a finger on your right hand, or you could tension it around a finger on your left hand if you are an English knitter. So here's my final stitch. It looks really, really loose. So I'm just going to go ahead and knit it as best I can. And now I'm going to tighten that up. I do this about every 2 to 4 rows. You flip it over to the wrong side and I take my yarn and I kind of just pull on it a little bit to retension my stitches on both sides. So now the edges look a little bit better. They're not as wonky and loose. Now if you're going to conserve yarn, you can just occasionally tighten up the ends and then just keep working. But if you're not conserving yarn, you could cut in the middle. And then for every 2 rows, you're going to tie them together. So I'm going to tie them in a knot, and as I pull the knot down, I'm not going all the way down. So I leave a little bit of space here at the bottom, and then I start to work another knot. And this one I pull tight, and that should kind of tighten up the bottom one a little bit, but that way you're not cinching your ends. If you tie the first knot too tight, it will kind of cinch your edges of your swatch. So again, you tie a knot, but you leave just a little bit of space at the end and you start to tie another knot and then you pull that one tight and you should be good to go. And you can trim them short too if you like. You don't have to, but I like to trim them a little bit shorter so I know which ones I've tied and which ones I haven't. And this is what it looks like from the wrong side so far. And I just repeat that process. So again, I'm going to slide down to the other needle. So I bring my yarn behind my work and tension it on a finger on my right hand. Work across, and the process just repeats for the entire swatch. It's really common for the last stitch or the last 2 stitches to get kind of stretched out, so this looks really wonky. I kind of just hold on to it and knit it as best I can, and then you can flip it over and kind of pull on each of these tails just a little bit to cinch up those stitches on both sides. And you just do that all the way up. And then what I like to do for all my swatches, I always take a yarn needle and thread all of my final stitches onto a piece of waste yarn instead of binding off. I feel like it gives me a much more accurate reading on my gauge. Here's a couple examples of some swatches that I made in the round in the past. So this is what I mean about putting it on waste yarn. So I didn't bind off, I just put it on a piece of waste yarn like this. The amount of knots represents the needle size that I used. So I used a US 10 because there are 10 knots. And this is a really great trick because sometimes I'll make a swatch and then completely forget about it for a few weeks. So this is unblocked, but if I was conserving yarn, this is what I would do. I have all these really long floats. They're wider than my project is. And you want that because if it's too tight, it'll kind of cinch up your project. So you want your floats to be longer than your project is wide. So then I would just wash it. And if you're going to pin it, I would flip it over so the floats are showing and then pin it. But oftentimes I'll just flip it over and let it dry like this without pinning. So it's a little bit harder to measure because it's kind of wonky underneath, but it gets the job done. But then here's an example of one that I made where the floats were cut. This is a waffle stitch, but again, I put it on waste yarn instead of binding it off, and I put knots at the top so that I could see that I used a US 5. By trimming the ends, it makes a really flat swatch, so it is much easier to read that way. But if you're conserving yarn, there's nothing wrong with really long floats in the back, because for this, I could unravel this. I could just pull out my waste yarn and unravel this, and I would have yarn. With this, each row is basically its own strand of yarn, so you cannot unravel this. So it just depends on whether you're conserving yarn or not. But yeah, that is how you work a swatch in the round. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please give the video a like and subscribe for more. It really helps the channel out. I hope to see you guys in a future video.